The sun, a merciless orb of fire, bleached the Libyan sky to a pale, searing white, hammering the barren, rocky ground of a peninsula jutting into the Mediterranean like a festering wound. The heat was a physical entity, a weight that pressed upon the shoulders, a dryness that cracked lips and filled the lungs with every parched breath. It was April 1941, and the air itself shimmered, not just with the mirages of the desert, but with a metaphysical tension, a palpable foreboding of the storm about to break. Below, the landscape was a monochrome tapestry of dust, rock, and despair, a fortress of sand and stone known as Tobruk. From the panoramic view of a reconnaissance pilot, it appeared as a desolate, God-forsaken patch of earth, a mere speck on the vast, unforgiving canvas of the North African desert. But on the ground, it was a sprawling, intricate labyrinth, a honeycomb of deep dugouts, reinforced sangars, and cunningly concealed weapon pits, all interconnected by a web of communication trenches. This was no mere defensive line. It was a meticulously constructed, multi-layered killing zone held by a desperate, polyglot force of Australians, British, Indians, and Poles. They were the flies in the ointment of Erwin Rommel's flawless campaign, completely surrounded and cut off from the main Allied lines by the lightning-fast, seemingly unstoppable armoured divisions of the Desert Fox. The German Afrika Korps, fresh from a string of stunning victories that had swept the British Eighth Army aside in a blur of dust and panic, now had its boot firmly on the throat of this vital port. To Rommel and his triumphant legions, its fall was not a matter of if, but when. A logistical certainty, a mere formality that would clear the path for the final, decisive push to the Suez Canal and the oil-rich fields beyond. The world, watching with bated breath, expected another swift, humiliating capitulation, another Dunkirk etched in sun-scorched sand. But what they did not know, what Rommel and his staff officers, tracing lines on their maps with confident strokes, could not yet comprehend, was that they had just sealed the fate of their own invincible aura within the crumbling, 50-kilometre perimeter of this defiant fortress. This was not the beginning of an end, but the end of a beginning, a moment of stubborn, unyielding resistance that would fundamentally fracture the momentum of the war in the desert and become a legend whispered from Cairo to London. This is the story of the Siege of Tobruk, the fortress that would not break, and the men who, with grim pride, earned the title, the Rats of Tobruk. The architect of this impending victory, Lieutenant General Erwin Rommel, had, until this point, orchestrated a flawless ballet of blitzkrieg across the North African desert. It was a masterclass in mechanized warfare, a symphony of movement and fire. His Panzer IIIs and IVs, their grey hulls dusted a pale yellow, were the scalpel, and his aggressive, intuitive strategy was the steady, aggressive hand that wielded it. The British Eighth Army, by contrast, was in utter disarray, its formations shattered, its confidence broken, its commanders struggling to comprehend the speed and audacity of an enemy who seemed to materialize from the desert itself. In this grand strategic picture, Tobruk was the last logistical linchpin, the only deep water port between Tripoli and Alexandria capable of sustaining a large, thirsty, mechanized army. For Rommel, it was the essential lifeblood, the supply hub without which his final, triumphant lunge towards the Suez Canal would wither and die in the desert. For the Allies, it was a dagger pointed directly at the underbelly of his extended, tenuous supply lines, a constant, nagging thorn that threatened to bleed his advance dry with every day it remained in hostile hands. The fortress itself was a relic of earlier Italian colonial ambitions, a perimeter of concrete strongpoints, deep anti-tank ditches, and tangled coils of wire stretching over 50 kilometers. In the age of the tank, it was considered obsolete, a static garrison in a war of motion, a death sentence for any force foolhardy enough to be trapped within. Rommel's plan was simple, brutal, and had worked with devastating effect everywhere else. A swift, concentrated assault to shatter the defences, overwhelm the presumed demoralised defenders, and hoist the swastika over the harbour. He gave the garrison days, perhaps a week, to collapse under the weight of German might. The world, reading the dispatches, agreed with his assessment. But the world and Rommel were profoundly and tragically wrong. But within that sun-blasted perimeter, a different kind of army was taking shape. An army forged not in the pristine parade grounds of Prussia, but in the crucible of the Australian outback and the grim practical realities of desert warfare. They were the Rats of Tobruk, a name bestowed upon them in derision by Nazi propaganda lord Haw, who had scoffed during a broadcast that the men defending the garrison were caught like rats in a trap. The men, primarily the 9th Australian Division, seized upon the insult with a characteristic mix of defiance and dark humour, wearing the title as a badge of honour. Their commander was the pugnacious, indefatigable Australian Major General Leslie Morshead, a veteran of the Gallipoli campaign who had learned the bitter lessons of static warfare a generation before. Known as Ming the Merciless for his relentless demands and unyielding resolve, Morshead was a soldier's soldier. These men under his command were not professional, stoic soldiers in the European mould. They were citizen soldiers from the vast outback stations and the bustling cities of Australia. Tough, irreverent, resourceful, and possessed of a deep-seated, ingrained distrust of authority that made them uniquely immune to the panic and psychological pressure that often preceded a German assault. Morshead's doctrine was not one of passive, hole-in-the-ground defence, but of aggressive, almost fanatical counterattack. His order to his officers was unequivocal and left no room for interpretation. "There'll be no Dunkirk here. If we should have to get out, we shall have to fight our way out. There is to be no surrender and no retreat." He transformed the static Italian defences into a dynamic, aggressive killing zone, a defence in depth that was designed not merely to hold the line, but to actively lure, dismember and bleed the attacker white. He instituted a relentless schedule of night patrols, a form of intimate, brutal warfare the Germans initially despised and for which they were utterly unprepared. The desert between the lines, which in European warfare would have been a sterile no-man's land, became an Australian hunting ground, a nocturnal theatre of silent, shadowy violence where the advantage lay entirely with the audacious, unseen defender who knew every inch of the rocky terrain. The first, crucial test of this new doctrine came with the dawn of April 11th, 1941. The German 5th Light Division, spearheaded by the confident veterans of the 8th Machine Gun Battalion, advanced across the open ground, expecting to brush aside a disorganized, demoralized rearguard. They were met not by panic, but by a tempest of concentrated, pre-planned fire. The Australian artillery, its gunners having spent days pre-registering every likely approach, laid down a curtain of steel that was both accurate and sustained. The German infantry, trained for the sweeping maneuver of blitzkrieg, found themselves pinned down in the open by invisible defenders firing from cleverly camouflaged positions. Their forward momentum shattered into a bloody stalemate. Then came the Australian counterattacks, the hallmark of Morshead's strategy. Small, independent groups of men, bayonets fixed and faces set in grim determination, would materialize as if from the very earth itself, launching local, vicious assaults that reclaimed lost ground and inflicted disproportionate casualties in a whirlwind of grenades and rifle fire. The German war diaries from that day note a palpable sense of shock and confusion, a profound bewilderment at the ferocity and unpredictability of the resistance. This was not how the war in Africa was supposed to be fought. The defenders were not cowering in their holes awaiting death or capture. They were swarming out of them with lethal intent like, well, rats. The first major assault was bloodily and decisively repulsed, a clear, unmistakable signal that the blitzkrieg, for the first time, had stalled. Rommel, frustrated and impatient, initially attributed the failure to poor reconnaissance and the stubbornness of colonial troops, a critical misjudgment of his enemy's caliber and resolve that would cost him dearly in the coming months. He would try again, with more force and greater fury, but the element of surprise, and more importantly, the psychological weapon of German invincibility, had been permanently blunted on the wire at Tobruk. What seemed like an inherent weakness, the static, immobile nature of a besieged garrison, was, under Morshead's brilliant and ruthless command, becoming its greatest and most unexpected strength. While Rommel's Afrika Korps was a magnificent precision instrument of offensive warfare, it was ill-suited, almost crippled, by the grinding, resource-sapping attrition of a protracted siege. Its lifeblood was fuel, ammunition and spare parts, all flowing along a precarious, 1,000-mile supply line snaking its way from Tripoli, a fragile artery constantly harassed and severed by the Royal Air Force and the audacious submarines and surface forces of the Royal Navy. Operating from the unsinkable aircraft carrier of Malta, the mighty panzers, designed for the open plains of Europe, were mechanical marvels of complexity, but their intricate engines and fine tolerances choked on the fine, abrasive, all-pervasive dust of the desert, requiring constant, difficult maintenance that was nearly impossible to perform under siege conditions. The defenders, by stark contrast, were supplied by sea, a tenuous but resilient lifeline that defied all of the Luftwaffe's and Kriegsmarine's best efforts to sever it. The Royal Navy's inshore squadron and a handful of determined merchantmen, collectively dubbed the Tobruk ferry service, ran a nightly gauntlet of screaming Stuka dive bombers and lurking E-boats. This was a high-stakes nightly gamble with death where sleek, fast destroyers, veteran ships like the Australian HMAS, Vendetta, and Waterhen, would slip into the darkened harbour with engine room crews pushing them to the limit, unloading their precious cargo in a frenzy of activity before the dawn revealed them to the enemy. They brought in reinforcements, crates of small arms ammunition, massive spare gun barrels for the artillery, medical supplies, and the most precious commodity of all in the desert, fresh water. On the return journey, they evacuated the wounded, the burned, the shattered, the diseased, maintaining morale and keeping the fighting force within the perimeter relatively fresh and resilient. This tenuous maritime lifeline was the fortress's beating heart, a testament to the raw courage of the sailors who risked their lives night after night. And it was a problem the Germans, for all their tactical genius, could never quite solve. The psychological warfare waged within the minds of the men was as critical to the defense as any artillery piece or machine gun. For the rats inside the perimeter, life settled into a brutal, unending cycle of extreme hardship. The days were an inferno, the sun a malevolent eye in the sky. The nights brought a shocking, bone-chilling cold that seeped into the dugouts. Water was rationed to a precious few pints a day for drinking, cooking, and the most rudimentary of washes. A constant, gnawing reminder of their isolation and dependency on the sea. The diet is a monotonous and inadequate litany of hardship. Bully beef, tinned corned beef, hardtack biscuits so durable they were nicknamed hardtack, and a thin sugary jam, a combination that led to widespread vitamin deficiencies and suppurating, painful desert sores that refused to heal. Flies, born of the latrines and the unburied dead in no man's land, swarmed in their millions, a black, buzzing plague that covered every surface, invaded every mouthful of food, and drove men to the brink of madness. But it was the relentless, impersonal artillery and aerial bombardment that wore most heavily on the nerves. The rising, screaming dive of the Stuka, the ear-splitting Jericho trumpet siren attached to its landing gear, was a psychological weapon in itself, designed to induce pure terror before the bombs even fell. Yet the rats adapted with a grim practicality. They dug deeper and deeper, their burrows evolving into elaborate underground homes with multiple rooms, sandbagged walls, and even stolen furniture, a subterranean city of defiance. They cultivated a gallows humor so dark it became a language of its own, a cynical irreverence that served as their primary psychological shield against the absurdity of their situation. They printed their own newspaper, the Tobruk Truth, a crude but vital morale booster that often exaggerated Allied successes and mocked their own dire hardships. In sheltered, bomb-cratered gullies they played two-up, the Australian gambling game, a defiant act of normalcy and chance in the face of overwhelming, deterministic danger. This normalization of the absurd, this daily, unspoken defiance in the face of overwhelming firepower, forged a psychological armor that the Germans could not penetrate with mere bombs or broadcasts. They were not facing a professional army waiting stoically for relief. They were facing a hardened community, a tribe determined to outlast its besiegers, a community that had found an unbreakable strength in its shared misery and its collective refusal to yield an inch. Rommel, the master of maneuver and the fluid battlefield, was now trapped in a battle of attrition he could not win, a siege that was rapidly becoming a festering stain on his pristine reputation. His famed momentum, and with it the thrust of the entire North African campaign, was stalling against this stubborn, unyielding rock. He threw his best units, the seasoned infantry and the armoured might of the 15th Panzer Division, against the perimeter in a series of furious, costly assaults throughout April and May. The Battle of the Salient on April 30th saw some of the fiercest, most desperate fighting of the entire siege. A massive German attempt to use brute force to break the Australian line. German combat engineers, under heavy fire, managed to breach the outer wire and anti-tank ditch, creating a narrow corridor. Through this gap, the panzers surged, achieving a shallow but dangerous penetration. It was the critical moment, the tipping point, at which every other British defence in the desert had crumbled and turned into a rout. But Morshead had anticipated this exact scenario. His defence in depth now proved its worth. The infiltrating German tanks, instead of running rampant in the rear areas, found themselves channeled into pre-designated killing zones, where concealed 2-pounder anti-tank guns, handled with cold fury by British and Australian crews who held their fire until the last possible moment, opened up at point-blank range. Simultaneously, the infantry of the 9th Australian Division launched immediate, furious and localised counterattacks, often fighting the elite German panzer grenadiers with bayonets, grenades and raw courage in the confusing, dust-choked darkness. The line bent under the immense pressure, wavering in places. But it never broke. The German attack was halted, their gains measured in a few hundred yards of blood-soaked, worthless desert, purchased at a cost in men and material that the Afrika Korps could simply not afford. The German war diaries from this period repeatedly express a growing frustration and a lack of understanding towards the Australians' unconventional, fanatical and unpredictable fighting style, a clear testament to the success of Morshead's ruthless doctrine of aggressive defence. As the siege stretched from weeks into months, a unique technological and tactical evolution occurred within the cauldron of Tobruk. The defenders, forced into innovation by necessity, became undisputed masters of the art of the raid, a tactic that kept the besiegers constantly off balance and psychologically on the defensive. Using the absolute blackness of the desert night as their cloak, small patrols of 20 to 30 hand-picked men would slither like ghosts across the pitted, wire-strewn no-man's land, their faces blackened with burnt cork, their weapons taped to silence any telltale rattle, their movements a study in absolute silence. Their missions were not mere reconnaissance. They were exercises in pure, targeted destruction. They would overrun isolated German machine gun posts with sudden, overwhelming violence, lay explosives on the breaches of artillery pieces, and snatch terrified sentries from their posts for interrogation. One of the most legendary was the raid on the formidable Italian strongpoint at Medawar, where a single company of Australians, in a single night of brutal, close-quarters fighting with grenades, Thompson submachine guns, and the bayonet, systematically destroyed an entire battalion's worth of fortified positions and captured over 100 dazed and bewildered prisoners. These raids were more than just tactical victories. They were a constant, psychological reminder to the German High Command and the common soldier alike that they were the ones under observation, under threat, even in the perceived safety of their own lines. The night belonged unequivocally to the rats, and the German soldiers, exhausted by the constant vigilance and the fear of the silent, lethal shadows began to dread the setting of the sun, knowing it heralded the arrival of these relentless hunters from the fortress. Meanwhile, the war in the air and sea above and around Tobruk was a constant, high-stakes duel of attrition and courage. The Luftwaffe's Stukas and Messerschmitt Bf 109s dominated the skies by day, pounding the harbour and the defensive positions with methodical fury. But the Royal Air Force, though perpetually outnumbered and operating from primitive, dusty landing grounds just outside the perimeter, fought a desperate and heroic holding action. Hawker Hurricanes, their engines roaring defiance, would streak in at low level to engage the German bomber formations, their 8 Browning machine guns stitching lines of fire across the blue canvas of the sky. On the ground, the defenders became artists of deception and survival. They learned to disperse their supplies into countless small hidden caches, to camouflage their positions with an almost artistic touch using nets, rocks and debris, and to use their Bofors and other anti-aircraft batteries with devastating coordinated efficiency, filling the sky with a deadly lattice of flak that took a steady toll on the attackers. The harbour itself became a graveyard of sunken ships, their twisted masts and funnels protruding from the oil-slicked water as grim monuments to the cost of supply. Yet still, against all odds, the Tobruk ferry service persevered. Its captains and crews, a mix of Royal Navy and Australian sailors, displayed a level of steadfast courage that defied logic and statistics. Each ship that slipped through the deadly blockade was a victory in itself. Each ton of supplies delivered was another nail in the coffin of Rommel's ambitions. This constant, if trickling flow of supplies and particularly the infusion of fresh troops from the British 70th Division, who were smuggled in to gradually relieve the exhausted Australians, was the critical, unsung factor in maintaining the garrison's fighting strength and, just as importantly, its will to resist throughout the long, grueling 242 days of the siege. By the high summer of 1941, the strategic picture of the North African campaign had shifted dramatically, and it was the steadfast defiance of Tobruk that had been the catalyst. The British 8th Army, given a precious breathing space, was rebuilding, re-equipping with new American Grant tanks, and planning its own major offensive, codenamed Operation Crusader. The fortress that was supposed to be Rommel's springboard had become a relentless anchor, tying down some of his best German and Italian divisions, precious forces that were desperately needed for his own planned push east towards Egypt. The constant, draining need to supply the large besieging force strained his logistics to the absolute breaking point, forcing him to divert trucks, fuel and ammunition that were critical for his main advance. Most importantly, the invincible aura of the Afrika Korps had been irrevocably punctured. The world now knew, with concrete proof, that the German war machine could be stopped, outfought and outlasted. The rats of Tobruk, in their dusty, fly-blown and shell-cratered hellhole, had achieved what entire armies had failed to do. They had halted the seemingly unstoppable momentum of the Desert Fox, buying the Allies the most precious commodity of war, time needed to regroup, reinforce, and launch a decisive counter-offensive. The end of the siege came not with a weary whimper, but as part of a grand orchestrated symphony of violence. On November 18, 1941, the rebuilt 8th Army launched Operation Crusader, a massive, complex armoured thrust designed explicitly to relieve the fortress and destroy Rommel's forces. For the men inside Tobruk, the sound of distant, thunderous artillery duels to the east was the sweetest music they had ever heard, a promise of deliverance after 8 long months. For over a week, a brutal, swirling and chaotic tank battle, one of the largest the world had yet seen, raged across the desert escarpments south of Tobruk. The garrison, now a mixed force including the fresh, determined British 70th Division, prepared for its part, a violent breakout. On the night of November 26th, the New Zealand Division, fighting its way doggedly westward from the main relief force, smashed a hole in the encircling German lines. At the same moment, the Tobruk garrison, a coiled spring of pent-up fury for 242 days, unleashed its full force. In a coordinated, two-pronged assault, they thrust outwards, their infantry and tanks meeting the spearheads of the relieving New Zealanders at the strategically vital village of El Duda. The link-up was chaotic, emotional, and triumphant. A moment of profound relief, shared victory, and ragged cheers from men too exhausted for grand celebrations. The siege was over. The fortress had held. The legacy of Tobruk is etched not in marble, but in the very DNA of modern infantry tactics and the spirit of defiance. It provided a masterclass in the power of the aggressive defense, proving that air power and armored might alone could not subdue a determined, well-led, and ingeniously defended garrison. It demonstrated, beyond any doubt, the critical importance of morale and leadership that inspires not through fear, but through shared sacrifice, unwavering resolve, and a common identity. For Australia, Tobruk became a national touchstone, a defining symbol of the gritty, independent, and resilient digger spirit that formed the core of its military identity. A moment when the nation, through its sons, stood alone and defied the seemingly unstoppable tide of fascism. For the Allies in their darkest hour, it was the first real, sustained chink in the Axis armour, a beacon of hope that proved resistance was never futile. It taught the world a fundamental lesson of warfare, that blitzkrieg had its limits, that the defence, if conducted with aggression, intelligence, and sheer will, could master the offence. The men who endured those 242 days of fire, dust, and deprivation returned home as legends. The rats of Tobruk, who in their stubborn, bloody-minded defiance, had not only saved a strategically vital port, but had fundamentally altered the trajectory of the North African campaign, and by extension, the war. They stood in the dust and the fire, and where a world of onlookers saw certain defeat, they saw only the next day, and the duty to meet it on their own terms. And in that simple, unyielding courage, they forged a legend that would echo through history. A powerful and enduring reminder that even the smallest, Most isolated force can, through sheer tenacity and a refusal to break, change the course of history. The name Tobruk became synonymous with resilience, a word whispered in the war rooms and foxholes during the darkest days that followed, as a promise and a proof that no tide, no matter how fierce, flows forever, and that even a rat, when cornered, can fight like a lion.